But I didn't have any other options. It was my job. I'm essentially forced to stand there and watch people die. So I got the job in the summer of 2019 or 2018. I get this stuff mixed up because it's just all blended together at this point. Like I said, I can't tell you the name of the hospital, but it's a decently sized town for the state I live in. I wouldn't say major metropolitan, but enough that there's a pretty big gang presence in the town. Pretty big police presence in the town. Crime rate's pretty high. It's a pretty impoverished town, too. We're the biggest hospital in the entire city. Now, I'd worked hospital security before I took this job, but it was mostly small town work or military work. My command in the Navy was a naval hospital. Even though I was a master at arms, I was security. I was security for a field hospital. So I take this job, and I've heard that it's going to be a tough job, but it pays well for security in the area. But within the first 2 weeks of work in this place, we had a car pull up into the ER because, we have it's a typical hospital. You got an ER, you drive up and you can drop people off. We called it the ER circle because it was this little circle driveway. And this is 2 weeks in. Car pulls up in the middle of the night. Girl gets out. She's screaming. They've shot my boyfriend. They've shot my boyfriend. I go into immediate mode. So this guy in the back is shot. I throw the door open, pull him out. And as I pull him out, I see something that I've never seen before, which is brain matter. This lady hadn't told me that he was shot in the head. But as I'm pulling him out and onto his side, I pretty much see his head just spill out onto the car seat. So that was within my first 2 weeks of starting. It was hard to go a weekend without at least one person turning up shot, stabbed, beat. It's a rough town, and, I get used to it, especially when the winter first hits. It's not so crazy because it's true that cold weather, when it gets below freezing and the snow comes out, people tend to stay inside. They don't tend to cause problems when it's snowing out. And to also kind of paint you an idea, a lot of people think of security, they think, like Paul Blart. They think, rent a cop outfit with the badge and maybe a fake duty belt and a radio, and that's it. And they think you have no power. The hospital I worked at, we were dressed like security contractors. We had plate carriers on with level 3A rated body armor, which could take up to a .308 caliber bullet. And that carrier was ballistic nylon. We're in essentially black BDUs. We're dressed like operators. We're not dressed like rent-a-cops. We're not even dressed like the local police. We're dressed like soldiers. All we have is a taser and a radio. But, a taser's better than nothing. And plus, because we work in a hospital, because of HIPAA, we can't wear body cams because that would violate HIPAA. So we had a camera on the taser so that if you actually had to draw the taser and, draw down on somebody, the taser would record what was going on. And we had really good camera systems in the building. So we were really well equipped to handle just about any situation. We had a guy pull a knife on one of my partners. This was in October before the pandemic. He had a knife pulled on him. It was out in the parking lot. It wasn't in the ER proper. This guy was suicidal, and his family had brought him to us to get help. And we can't force anyone to get help because you have to be willing to get help. If you make suicidal statements, we're not cops. We can't pink slip you on the spot. We're not a doctor. We can't pink slip you on the spot because you say you want to kill yourself. So this guy is denying that he wants to kill himself and he wants to leave. His family's trying to stop him from leaving, and that's when the knife comes out. And at that point, you pull a knife on us, it's a little bit more different because at that point, you're threatening us. And you're threatening, staff and other people around you. So the police get called, they're en route, and this guy ends up surrounded by 3 security guards, and we're all draw down on him with tasers. And then the cops show up and they pink slip him and bring him into the ER. It's like mental health stuff. If you're not being brought in by the cops, it's all voluntary. So that can be a bit of an issue that I'm sure I'll bring up later. When I say we got into fights, it's not so much like punch, kick, that kind of fight. A lot of the time it's just grab a person, hold them down kind of fight. It's a lot more like grappling oriented. And our idea of a fair fight was like 2-on-1, 3-on-1, throw as many bodies at a person at one time, because we're not there to, throw hands. We're there to, protect staff, protect property. We'll hold you down. The nurses will sedate you, that kind of thing. So we're almost like hospital orderlies, like from the old days, but we're security guards. Anyway, so this is the kind of stuff we're dealing with on the daily, is people with mental illness who've been brought in by the cops. They don't want to be there. They're on 72-hour holds with a pink slip, and you can't lock them in a room. You have to sit on them. You actually have to sit at the doorway and watch these people and keep them from leaving, because they seem to think, and most people seem to think, that you have rights. You have the right to leave a building if you don't want to be there, right? Well, a pink slip legally removes that right from you. Basically, it enables a doctor or a police officer to say, hey, you've got some mental issues. We get to hold you for at least 3 days while we try to get you help. But it's not a quick process. Sometimes it can take even longer than 3 days for somebody to get placement in a mental hospital. So you get these people that are tied up in the system, especially people with insurance, because it works way different with insurance with mentally ill. That became one of the major breaking points of why I left that place, because it's just hard to deal with that. So that's like what we're dealing with all the time, is people off their psych meds, people on drugs, or just criminals who have been hurt and are coming to the ER for help. And sometimes they're running from the police. I remember in mid-December, I was just standing at the front of the ER. Some guy walked in, said, hey man, you need any help? He said, no, I'm good. I'm just here to be seen. I said, okay, that's cool. So he goes to get checked in. Not like 2 minutes later, here comes every cop car in the city. They pull right into our freaking ER, and they come rocking out, M4s, guns drawn, everything. And they said, hey, do you see a guy? Was there a guy in a blue hoodie that just came in through here? We're like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, he just shot somebody. And it's just like, so they drew down on this guy, and he was shot. He was like, he had been shot, but he'd put his hoodie over it. I couldn't even tell that the guy had got shot, but he'd packed a wound and everything. And it was just nuts. And so he got, seen and got operated on, and the cops sat on him, and then they took him away. But he turned out to be that this was just some big gangbanger coming in off the street because he'd been in a shootout. And we had a lot of that. Yeah, that's what we dealt with for, as long as I had started there in that summer till when the pandemic hit. And when the pandemic hit, I thought things were going to get easier. The night we shut the hospital down publicly should have been the tell-all. I ended up doing coming in early for a 12-hour shift just due to manpower, but it just so happened to be the day our hospital went into what we called lockdown. And we went room to room to room, taking visitors out of the building. So we were taking, grandkids away from grandparents who were on their deathbeds, husbands away from wives, boyfriends away from girlfriends. And people were outraged. You got to remember, this is when the pandemic first hit. We didn't really know anything about COVID. We didn't understand the infection rate. We didn't know how to treat it. We didn't understand any of that. So the hospital administration decided that the best thing to do was to leave the ER open and to lock all the entrances. No visitors whatsoever. Zero tolerance. And we were the ones that got stuck with enforcing that. And that was hard because, you're dragging, like I said, grandchildren away from their grandparents, and they're bawling their eyes out because they're terrified. I was terrified. Everyone was freaking terrified. It was insanity. And then we all got to wear masks. And if you think somebody has COVID, then you have to put on this big plastic gown, and you got to put on goggles, and you got to, put on an N95, which is a high filtration mask that they use for tuberculosis. And what was messed up is that my department, you didn't necessarily have to pass what they called a fit test. You had to get fitted for the N95 to make sure that it properly worked. And there were a lot of guys on our team that weren't properly fit tested because, the idea of us actually having to go into a room and, having to restrain somebody with tuberculosis wasn't going to be that common. So, just if that does come up, call up some guys who actually pass the fit test. We don't need the whole department to be fit tested. So we had like half a department of these guys that couldn't go into rooms or deal with COVID patients because they weren't fit tested. And if you had facial hair, you wouldn't pass the fit test. So if you weren't clean shaven, and we had a lot of guys, myself included, who had facial hair. So it's like, well, if you're fit tested, you have to be clean shaven. Then you see nurses walking around, male nurses, and they've got full beards and they're wearing N95s and they're going into COVID patients' rooms. And it was like we were the only ones that were taking this seriously, you know? It's like you'd think the nurses would be taking this seriously, but there are a lot of them that weren't. There were a lot of them that thought that it was just as much a joke or a farce as all these idiots on, Facebook and Twitter calling it a hoax, calling it this, calling it that. And for a while, we didn't see COVID patients. So yeah, it did kind of feel like blown out of proportion. And then, I don't know, within like a week of our lockdown, that's when we started getting positives. And it would come in waves. It'd be like a week straight, you'd have a ton of people coming in with COVID. And it wasn't like, because we didn't understand infection rates at the time and how it passed and how it was transmitted, like we had essentially turned the ER into a checkpoint. We had a little tent out in front of the drive. You had to pull up. We had, roll the window down, talk to you, be like, hey, are you experiencing these symptoms? Do you have a fever? Do you have a cough? Can you smell? Do you have a sense of taste? What are you here for? And it was like, if you weren't here for COVID, it's like, okay, here's a little restaurant cozer that vibrates. Go sit in the parking lot, and when that buzzes, then come inside. And if they were possibly COVID positive, then you'd send a nurse out, and they're all gowned up, and then they get swabbed, and then the test would take like an hour or two. It was a process, As COVID started showing up, our department got involved very quickly because we had essentially shut the hospital down. All elective surgeries, all elective procedures, they were put on hold. And very quickly, the hospital started hemorrhaging money. And then we had mass layoffs of various unnecessary departments. So this hospital with thousands of beds and thousands of employees is suddenly almost empty because you've got all these, various wings, cardiac wing, all these things that they'd done, like infusion therapy for cancer patients was going to home treatment. So we had a whole infusion therapy section that's just empty, just collecting dust. Just dead space. And it was weird, especially with me working night shift because I was already used to the building not having a whole lot of people in it. But then this building really became empty. And then we got involved in the COVID transportation. So if a patient was in bad enough condition that they were in the ER and they needed to be hospitalized, we basically had to become traffic guards. You'd have one guy like 10 feet out in front of a hospital bed as it was moving from the ER to the ICU or the MICU or wherever, we ended up converting a ton of rooms into COVID rooms with the negative pressure and all that to keep it isolated to that room. But you'd have like a guard 10 feet ahead and a guard 10 feet behind. And we were just there to basically body block anybody from getting in the way or even coming in anywhere near that patient's bed. Because again, we didn't understand transmission. And then you'd get into an elevator, and then you'd have to lock that elevator down and then take it up to the room, get them off on that floor, take them to the room, get back in the elevator, take it way down to the basement so that the cleaning crew could basically just spray the whole thing down with bleach and let it dry for like 20 minutes before they turned the system back on. And it was incredibly inconvenient because, each wing of the hospital only had like 3 elevators at each end. So if you ended up doing a bunch of code greens at once, there would be like no elevators. And we would have to be on standby if somebody up in like an ICU was getting treatment or they were getting put under. We'd be involved in transporting them to the OR or transporting them to another wing of the hospital. And you would have to stand there and wait for them to get tubed. You talk about the ventilators. There was that shortage of ventilators because that was like the only way we knew how to treat COVID at the time was to tube you, to put you on a ventilator. And because you had to stand there and be ready and wait, I'm essentially forced to stand there and watch people die. Because a lot of the times people would die when the ventilator was going in, because they'd get the pneumonia or the whatever, the nasal overflow that would come with really bad cases of COVID. And you would just have to watch them drown. in their own fluid. And everyone says that COVID was, a plague of old people. People were losing their grandparents. It wasn't all old folks. There were teenagers, there were kids. And what sucked most about the younger ones is that they still had, even with the old ones, everybody had family. And everybody wanted to be there for them. But because the hospital put a zero tolerance policy on visitation, while I would be sitting there watching this person die, my team would be out at the front of the ER fighting this person's family who just want to be there for them. And I just felt so bad for those folks. I felt bad for the person who was passing. I felt bad for the family, because if it was my mom or it was my brothers, I'd have fought like hell to be there with them. So you can understand why people were so angry, because these stories would be shared, certainly. Facebook, whatever, Twitter. Thousands of people a day were dying alone or surrounded by strangers who were just trying to save their lives, but they're not their loved ones. And we didn't know about monoclonal antibodies. We didn't know about steroids. We didn't know all these other ways that you could treat it. All we knew was the only way to keep them even possibly alive was to put them on a ventilator and just put them on suction and just drain their systems until it cleared up eventually. And that's why you got people that have got scar tissue. They're just lungs full of scar tissue. And they're disabled for life because of that, because we didn't know how else to treat it. So we're dealing with this, and then we're still dealing with all the crazy crap that this town spits up on the daily. You're getting into fights with drug addicts. You're getting into fights with mental patients. You're getting into fights with, family. And that no visitors policy applied to everybody. It didn't matter what you were in the ER for or what you were in the hospital for. There was no visitors. So that, 14-year-old gangbanger gets shot and killed on the corner and he ends up in RER. Now you've got his whole family out front, and they want to see they want to be there for their dead cousin or their dead son or whatever, and you can't let them back. I ended up fighting some kid's uncle, and this was like a proper fight. This wasn't just like, hold them down till nurse dates you fight. This is like street fight. And until I pulled the taser out, that's when he finally backed down. But it's just like, I didn't want to do that. But I didn't have any other options. It was my job. This is the only line of work I'd ever had. I didn't go to school. I was a bad student. I was a dropout, I joined the military. I was security. It was my best thing I ever had on my resume. It's the only line of work I could get. And you're getting paid, $18 an hour to fight some dude's uncle who just wants to be there for them while they're dying. And it just kept getting worse. It was like, as the pandemic went on, more and more people were just losing their frickin' minds. More and more, you'd have people there they'd be wanting to be seen for the most mundane, simple stuff in the ER, the broken toe or, you got a chest cold, normal stuff. And the nurses would say something or do something, and then it was like all of a sudden it was on like Donkey Kong. You'd have the 40-something soccer mom, all of a sudden she's punching out a nurse because she doesn't like the nurse's attitude. That's what I was on my team. We had talkers and we had fighters, and I was a talker because I didn't like fighting people. I've never liked fighting people. I want to help people. I've always wanted to help people. There were guys that came in shot. I put tourniquets on it. I put pressure on the wound. We had a lady come in. She was having seizures. I scooped her out of the car and carried her to the trauma bay in my arms. I ran as fast as I could because I knew That's what it took to save her life. Someone needed to get her to the trauma bay as fast as possible. Drug overdoses, stabbing victims, victims of domestic abuse. We were there. We were there at the entrance. We were there to help you if you needed help. And then I'd have to break up a fight because a nurse couldn't keep her mouth shut, you know? And there was the night I had my panic attack. It's kind of the beginning of the ending for me, but we were a close team. If there's one thing I cannot say anything bad about, it was the people I worked with, from the bosses down. The people I worked with were professionals, ex-cops, ex-military, good folk, hardworking folk that were like me. They cared. They wanted, not all of them, we had some bad ones, but they didn't tend to last long once the pandemic hit. Everybody who was there to just cash in a paycheck was pretty much out the door by the time we were hit this point. And I can't really give you guys names, so I'm just going to refer to these guys like alphanumerically. I'll give you their first initial and a number that was in their radio number. So this guy, we'll call him Delta 7. He's a retired sheriff's deputy. He's a solid guy. He's like me. His dad used to be a radio announcer like me. He's got that kind of, that cool talking man's voice, It's like she said that I had a storyteller's voice. It's clearly it's something genetic, You got good genes, you got a good talking voice. And he was exactly like that. But he's a lot older than me. And he's training a new guy. And the new guys aren't allowed to go hands-on with patients until they've been trained by our self-defense course. Until you've been properly trained, you can't put hands on a patient. We get a pretty routine call coming in. The local Metro Police are bringing this guy in on an ambulance. And that's not anything different. We get that all the time. But one of my buddies who's a paramedic who works for the local fire department, he tells us, hey, don't let the cops leave. This guy's trouble. Well, of course, as soon as they get him here, they offload him on us and the cops are gone. So this guy is built like the frickin' Rock, all right? This mental patient that they've brought in. Turns out later, I think he was on bath salts or something, but they say he's a mental patient. And I don't know exactly what happened because I was in a car outside. I was patrolling the parking lots. A few minutes after this guy gets here, we get called, code red, code red, code red, and it's the frickin' rookie that's calling. And a code red is an all call. It's a drop all your shit, get there now. We have a problem. So I pull up to the back of the ER. I hit my badge reader on the door. It doesn't read. I tear the back doors open with my bare hands, break the motors, run to the room that they're at, and there's Delta 7, and his arm's fucked up. This motherfucker threw him into the wall and dislocated his shoulder. And he's just laying there broken. And I grab this piece of shit and I throw him up against the wall. And he's just screaming at me and I'm just screaming at him. And I'm by myself. His hands are around my throat. I've got his arms locked down against my chest so he can't put pressure on my throat. He's trying to kill me. And I'm just telling him to stand down, stop it, stop it. That's all I'm screaming at him. And then like a blur of lightning, here comes Zulu 9. He comes up, he puts this guy in a choke lock and forces him down onto the ground. And then here comes the rest of the team. And we hold him down on the ground. And we'd never done this before. We actually put the nylon restraints. We had some people call them leathers. They're nylon restraints. They're like impossible to get out of. They got handcuff locks on them, the whole 9 yards. We put the nylons on him, and then we put him on the bed, and then when we secure the restraints to the bed. And I leave the room, and I get on the radio, and I tell command that we're secure, that we got him restrained, and that Delta 7 is down. And I could feel my chest is getting tight, but I just been in a fight. This guy is just trying to choke me out. We're kind of trying to calm down, and then they call and they say, we got a COVID escort. It's been waiting. We got to get somebody up there now. And of course, I don't hesitate. I'm like, I'm on it. I go. So I go up to the ICU and I'm there for the COVID escort. And then that nurse, that head nurse, is just like, where the fuck were you? Where the fuck you been? We've been waiting 20 fucking minutes. And I keep my cool. I tell her, look, we've been in a fight. We had one of our guys is down. He's hurt. We needed a minute. I'm sorry. All right. We're sorry. But something just happened. Let's get the patient moving. So we get the patient moved down to a floor. And then I'm walking away from it. And that tightness in my chest this whole time is just getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And it's getting harder to breathe. And as I'm walking away, here comes the night lead nurse. And he looks at me. He says, Jester, you okay? And as I'm trying to say that I'm fine, I don't know what happens. Next thing I know, I'm waking up and I'm looking at the ceiling. And I'm crying. And I can't breathe. They called it an acute stress reaction. It's something that comes with PTSD, I'm told. They took my ass down to the ER, my big 6'4", 265-pound ass in a wheelchair, down to the ER. They pumped me full of Ativan to calm me down. And here comes Delta 7 walking in. I guess they gave him pain meds. His arm's in a sling. And I have another panic attack. Just seeing him just triggered that image all over again. Just seeing him just lying there crumpled. I mean, he's fine. He's fine. I shouldn't be freaking out, but I am. And they send my ass home. They give me some time off. I go see a counselor. It's happened to cops. It's happened to soldiers. You know, you just have that freak out moment where you can't function anymore. You've hit the wall. And they tell you you've got post-traumatic stress. You got anxiety. And like I think I've told you folks, it's like my time in the military was not exciting. I never left the States. I never went overseas. I never saw combat or anything like that. So to be told that just from being a security guard at a hospital that you've developed PTSD and anxiety, it was like they were speaking a foreign language to me. You know, it's like you don't think that can happen to you. And then while all of this is going on, you've got all the deniers, you've got the fucking Karens who won't wear a mask, you've got the dudes coming in telling you that it's all a hoax. And then the vaccine comes out and it gets worse. You get more of these freaking deniers. And then the nursing shortage hits, and then the ER wait times go through the frickin' roof, man. They're completely out of the ballpark for what they used to be. You know, a bad night used to be like an 8-hour wait. Now you've got 12, 18, 24, 32-hour waits. No beds. And it's not that there's no beds in the hospital. It's that there's no nurses to cover the beds in the hospital. You can only put as many people in the hospital as you have nurses to cover beds. So you walk in at night to start your shift, and the ER is like a disaster relief shelter. There's people just covered in blankets, sleeping on the floor, sleeping on benches, piled up practically on one another. And now all of those drug addicts and mental patients that are waiting to be seen, they're just in amongst the general population. And now we're legitimately stopping street fights in our own ER lobby because some guy who's off his psych meds thought he heard somebody say something bad about his mom or whatever, and he was hearing voices in his head. That person didn't say a goddamn thing to him, but all of a sudden you have to break it up and you have to call the cops, and the cops really can't do anything because he's a mental patient off his freaking meds. He needs to be pink slipped. He needs to be placed, but you have nowhere to place him. So it's just a vicious cycle. The most they would do for you is take him to a different hospital, and then they would bring him back. And it was just like, they take him to that hospital, bring him back, take him back, bring him back, bring him back until they could finally get a room for him. A lot of the times we let him walk, and we weren't supposed to let him walk, but what could you do? You know? What were you supposed to do? There's no room. There's no one to help them. There's no room where they can sleep. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And I don't know if it was just getting worse because of my anxiety, my paranoia. I stopped showering. I stopped taking care of myself. I was just, sleeping all day, put my uniform on, go to work, come home, sleep, get up, go to work, sleep, just over and over and over again. I couldn't escape. And, I'm someone who believes experts when it comes to, like science and stuff. I trust doctors. So when they tell you to stay home, I'm going to stay the hell home. But it's like you get time off, you can't go anywhere. You're taking a vacation in your house. And that's kind of nice, but it's like you can't really unwind. And I live in the same city, and my friends are all people I work with. So all I get to hear about is all the, on text messages and stuff and phone calls, all you're hearing about is all the crazy shit that's going on at the hospital while you're not there. And you feel guilty because you're not there to help. And you get people online, you try to, or even on the street, you try to talk to them about this, family, friends, whatever, and they don't believe you. They think you're telling stories, or they think that you're part of the cover up. That's like, dude, if I'm part of the cover up, there's a hell of a lot of zeros missing off my paycheck. I was making pennies on the dollar every day, putting my life on the line to protect this hospital. And for what? To protect people who were healers. They were just there to help people. But then you realize that that's not really how it works. The health system in America is a business. The patients are product. They're not people to be helped. They're people to be treated and sent out so that they can pay the bill. As the nursing shortage happened and the scalping started happening, where you've got all these nurses that are roving from town to town to town because you've got these sign-on bonuses with like a contract for a few months. And then as soon as that contract's up, they go to the next one. So it's just this revolving door of nurses, and all of them are just there for a paycheck. The people that are there to help, those are the ones you see every day, but a lot of them are older and they're retiring. Or they caught COVID and they died. And, I'm just a grunt. I don't have answers. I don't know how this is supposed to be run. You give me orders, I'm going to carry out those orders. But eventually I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't walk into that ER and see that ocean of people just waiting for somebody to cure what ails them. And they look at you like you're trash. Because, yeah, you're dressed up like a soldier. You're all big and scary, and some people look at you with fear. When the Black Lives Matter riots were going on downtown, we were terrified. Unjustifiably, I found out. But you work with enough ex-cops that you become terrified that the rioters downtown will come to our campus and attack us. It never happened. But that's the kind of fear you have. Because you're dressed like authority. A lot of these gangbangers, they don't see a badge. You fit the look to them, you're the law. Even though I was nowhere near a cop, my authority ended at the property line. I just want people to understand that this is still going on. This isn't over yet. As we record this shit is still going on. And it's not just isolated to my hospital that I worked at. I told you that I was part of a naval medical unit. I have friends that work in hospitals all across the country. The wait times, the violence, it's all there. But it can't be talked about because you can't give specific instances or, this or that or the other thing. And usually it's HIPAA. But HIPAA just keeps you from telling people specific, I can't give you names, I can't give you dates, I can't give you anything like that, because then that would be a breach of someone's private medical information. And a lot of assaults that happen in hospitals, they don't go to court. They don't see the light of day in a court because, yeah, grandma scratched the eyes out of a nurse, but she's got dementia, so sorry. So it never sees the light of day of a courthouse. Most of the ones that we dealt with that ended up going to court were guys that were visitors that assaulted somebody on our property, But this is still going on. The wait times, the nursing shortage, the people that come into these ERs and try to tell medical professionals how to do their jobs, or that they're wrong, that they're somehow part of some massive conspiracy. And that's not what it's about at all. Somehow it became a political issue. And it should have never been a political issue. America united and fought off the polio virus with a vaccine. They united and fought off the Spanish flu. We used to do that. When a medical problem spread across the country, we would unify. But this time we didn't. Somehow, this virus that can infect anyone. And yeah, it's not as deadly as we thought it was initially. But to a specific group of people with breathing issues, the morbidly obese, the elderly, it is incredibly dangerous to them. People with compromised immune systems, it's incredibly dangerous for them. And yeah, you might just get unlucky and be that 1 in a million who catches it, even though you had nothing wrong with you. It takes you. That was one of the nurses, not at the hospital I worked at, but there was a hospital not too far from ours. There was a nurse. She was perfectly fine, healthy, no medical issues. She caught it, she died. And it was early on. Now, we have treatments. It's much more survivable. But it is only survivable if you trust in doctors, if you trust in nurses, and you get the shot. Get the booster even. Not because it's going to put microchips in your bloodstream. They don't need to put microchips in your bloodstream. You have a smartphone. You have the most sophisticated tracking device ever devised in your pocket 24/7. Anybody can hack that son of a bitch, know where you are, what you're saying, what you're doing. In matters of boot making, defer to the cobbler. When it comes to specific things, you defer to the people that specialize in that specific thing. You don't defer to your politician. You don't defer to the bread maker. You don't defer to anybody who isn't a part of that expertise, that expert field. So if a doctor tells you that there's a highly infectious virus and this vaccine can help you not die from it, you should listen to him. Because he's not a politician. He's an expert. I think it makes sense. But I'm the crazy one. I tell family these kinds of stories, and they look at me like I'm lying. And they look at me like I'm telling tall tales. And I get it. I was an imaginative kid. I was the boy who cried wolf when I was a little boy, but I'm not a little boy anymore. I'm 32 years old. I've had a hard life. I've seen real shit. I have no reason to lie about any of this. I tell people these stories to try and help. To try and help people understand what is going on right now. Yeah, it's freaking terrifying. But you need to listen. If not for your own sake, then for the sake of everyone.